Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game Battle Report. Today we're playing Vanilla Combined Army versus Spiral Core, and the scenario is Acquisition. Now, this is the Combined Army list I would be playing for this game, and this is actually a list I've had a couple of separate requests to play on the channel, from channel supporters Jordan and Matt. Matt's request specifically was to play it in Evacuation. Matt, I don't think I'm going to be able to get to that in anything like a timely manner. Still, I hope this battle report is interesting to you. Now, this is a style of combined army list that I have been playing for some time. In that vein, I would kind of call it an early N4 archetype, but it has stood up very well under quite reasonable combined army nerfs over the course of the N4 edition, and it's been modernized just slightly with the addition of a few pieces, some of which I think you can flex in and out, but in particular the Dartok adds quite a lot in terms of just making the list more well-rounded and having fewer vulnerabilities. Now, the list is built around two real Apex pieces, the first of which is the Charonted Lieutenant Hacker. Inexplicably the cheapest Charonted profile at only, quote-unquote, 63 points. This is a heavy infantry, plasma rifle, hacking device plus, whip 16 package. And what that means is that it makes full use of all of the rules and attributes that the Charonted comes with. So the fact that, yes, it's a Whip 16 profile, it's your lieutenant, so you're making full use of Whip 16 that way, and it's a hacker, which means you have just outstanding active and reactive hacking, including the all-important Whip 16 Spotlight, if that's a play that you want to make. Because the Charonted is only 63 points, we've got enough points left with the rest of the list to take a full proper Raicho multi-HMG HRL, which means that the list is able to pair Apex hacking capability with a full main battle tag. The Raichu is a very solid, very serviceable MBT. It's got the multi-HMG, Ballistic Skill 14, Armor 8, BTS 6, plus a nice suite of rules that allow it to operate without things like engineer support. So for example, the fact that it's veteran means it can't be isolated, which means that if it gets hit by EM rounds, it's only immobilized, which even at Whip 12 it can reset out of. It's crit immune, so it is less likely to go down to particularly a stroke of bad luck. And that means that you don't need to add anything else to a list. You can just chuck the Raichu in for 73 points and it will function very, very well. And those two, they make up, yes, almost half of the list by themselves, but they leave enough air in the list to run really a full suite of everything else we might want, including the complete hacking package. And so that means that the Charonted is being supported by both Bit and Kiss and the Dartok. And so that gives us two additional hackers, both of which have pitches, something that the Charonted lacks and really benefits from, both of which have some kind of hacking ARO. You have a full suite of hacking programs from the Dartok and Oblivion from Bit. And then most importantly, both of which have Trinity, which means that this list has the ability to punch down into enemy hackers that it drops a picture onto. Neither Bit nor the Dartok have quite the same level of hacking as something like, for example, the Anathematic, which you would take if you wanted true info war dominance. But between the two of them, they should do well enough to get you hacking dominance in a game against anything down to about middleweight enemy hacking, provided they don't have to fight things like, say, an Asura or an Anathematic themselves. Now, this list is also running a vector operator with Spitfire. You can cut that for something like an Umbra Samaritan, which frees up SWC to add in a Mine Layer Libertos. You need to find points for that, and to find those points, you typically cut a Datarazi down to something cheaper. The rest of the list otherwise is just warbands and support. We have a bunch of auto-generating pieces. We have the missile launcher, essential if you're running those pitches, and the Whip 16 Spotlight Hacker. Then we have 3 Datarazi and just a selection of irregulars. In this case, it's 2 Taiga creatures, but I think for the actual game that we played, I would change these around for something like a Taiga creature, a Gaki, and a motorized bounty hunter. That was an update I made to the list just ahead of playing the game. Or perhaps more accurately, I had lost this list and I had to reconstruct it prior to playing the game, and so that was a change that I made. Having now made that change, I think I would probably comfortably revert back to this. 2 Taiga creatures is just really nice and clean, and we get more regular orders in this version, but you can really go either way. So in total, what this list is doing is it is playing to two of Combined Army's big strengths. The first is just good quality high-end pieces, those things that cost well over 50 points and perform really, really well. It's got an excellent hacking network capable of really corralling enemies and just putting them through the ringer in terms of both active and reactive hacking opportunities. And then finally, it plays that low army combined end, Datarazis, R-drones, Imatrons, Taiga creatures, etc., that bulks the list out. It's a very, very solid, very strong list, and it has pretty much stayed strong for all of N4. Now, playing against Combined Army today, we have the Spiral Core, played by community local and very good Spiral Core player Ed. This is continued experimentation by Ed, just running through all of the different profiles that are in Spiral Core, in this case in particular trying out the Rassail Lieutenant. Now, this is a really rough matchup for Spiral Core. We'll see this as we get into the game and as we talk through why, in particular, this kind of matchup is very, very difficult for them. But Ed was going to be up against the wall here. Now, the list that he's using, I quite like generally, but it is a little bit experimental. Still, we have a good core. We have these two helots with camouflage, submachine gun, light rocket launcher, diplomatic delegate, Kael'thar chain of command. Now, you might sometimes be able to cut that chain of command down in other lists that are running more concealed lieutenants, but in this case, we have a Rassail lieutenant, which makes the chain of command well worthwhile. We have a zero pain hacker wardrover with boarding shotgun. It's 12 points for a boarding shotgun with specialist bonuses in this mission. This list was built for things like acquisition, and so the wardrover is very good at pressing those side buttons in this scenario. And at only 12 points is a worthwhile upgrade over something like, say, a Chaxa. We then have a Gryphop. Ed is an absolute connoisseur of Gryph operators in most of his lists. Then we jump into Combat Group 2. So this is a 6-9 split. We have 9 orders in Combat Group 2. And I believe, no, it's not 3 triads, but it's 2 triads. The first of which is Nima Sitar with Spitfire, a Kriegel with Breaker Combi Smoke Grenade, and a Kusil Engineer with K1 Combi. Ed has been putting K1 rounds into more of his lists because there is a relatively limited amount of anti-tag firepower in Spiral if you don't reach for things like the K1 Corsul. Yes, smoke shooting with the Tagma Viral Sniper can do some work, but there are a number of tags that are BTS 9, and you just do not want to be fighting BTS 9 things with stuff like the Tagma Sniper, and we knew that there would be, for example, Torchlight Brigade at this event, and so the event this game was played at, and so in terms of matchups that are just absolutely terrible for the Tagma, unsurprisingly, we have the Silverstar Prime front and center there, so Ed was reaching for other things to try out. So we've got this fire team, Nima, Kriegel, Kursil. Then we have a Dral, Minelair, AP Marksman Rifle, Kriegel, and Tagma Tricore. Now, Ed is not usually a player of the Tricore Tagma. For 20 points, it's not super worthwhile, but there is a particular niche for it in this list, which is that otherwise there are no Tagmas in the list, and you want to take counterintelligence in Spiral, it's just a good thing to have. So when you think about it in terms of being a counterintelligence profile in addition to the stuff that it's providing, yeah, it's actually not so bad. I and he probably wouldn't reach for it if there were any other Tagma in the list, but there weren't in this case, so it made sense to include it. We then have the Rassail Lieutenant with Viral Combi Rifle weighing in at 36 points, and then 2 Chaxa FTO sensors with heavy flamethrowers just for orders and deployment zone defense. Now, there are a lot of things in this list to like, but in particular, I think it plays very well to the fact that it has multiple smoke throwers and then close assault pieces to advance under cover of either smoke or eclipse. Kriegel can, technically speaking, lay down mirror ball zones. Now, 1 dice on 13, you never want to be doing that if you don't have to. It's better to fire 2 dice with the smoke grenade launchers. But if you do need to block an MSV, you do have that option. And having that option in redundancy is something that's very nice to have. In regular Tohar, of course, you just have McCalls as far as the eye can see. Spiral don't have that option, and so paying for the Kriegel agents gets you a lot of things that are solid. It gets you a Razor defensive ferroware, it gets you a linked breaker combi rifle, it gets you a linked smoke grenade launcher, and then of course it gives you that ferroware tactics mirror ball option just as a backup against enemy MSVs. The Rassail Lieutenant is also a piece that is not easy to fit in almost any list. It is ultimately 36 points, but if you can include it, it's a piece that I really enjoy playing with. Rassails are excellent, and I don't think Ed had played with one in some time, and it would be an important piece for him this game. Otherwise, though, as mentioned, this is a difficult matchup, just generally, for Spiral Core. We can see the beginnings of that here in this list, where we look and we say, oh, hey, cool, you have 3 different profiles that have a Razor. That's excellent. That gives you some really good pseudo-hacking in your deployment zone. You can isolate things like bears and warbands that are coming at you, and in fact, you're much better at doing that than something like a Jammer would be, because of how powerful a Razor is with double action ammunition, etc. Except, and here is where it begins, I am playing Combined Army, which means that I have, in this case, 3 models that are offensive close assault warbands, which are Morats, which means that they can't be subject to a Razor because they can't be isolated. This, however, is just the beginning of how challenging this matchup can be for Spiral. Let's jump onto the table and take a look to see how things get worse from there. So I would win the lieutenant role. I think I crit on a 16, and I elected to go first. Depending on the faction that I'm playing, I am often relatively comfortable going second into Spiral Core. Yes, you run the risk of Spiral Core impersonators taking a proper run at you and really tearing you up, but the thing about going second against Spiral Core is that it alleviates the requirement much of the time to fight helots. If I'm playing a scenario like Supremacy with second turn scoring, I am relieved of the obligation to fight my way forward quite as much if I'm not going first, because I can do second turn scoring, I can just dictate that force only to where it needs to be. I can use things like smoke, etc., because I don't have to survive on my opponent's half of the table for more than that end of round scoring, etc. Basically, if you don't have to fight helots, you're immediately in a much more comfortable place against factions like Spiral Core and Varuna, and going second, admittedly wearing the risk of impersonation attacks, is one of the ways to do that. However, in this matchup, playing as combined army with this kind of a hacking network, we have an alternate way to approach the situation, which is why I chose to go first. Despite the fact that acquisition ostensibly is end of game, second player favored scoring, I find that with the zones as close as they are, with 16-inch deployment zones, there is a significantly less space between player deployment zones. You have the option to attack and aggress quite effectively, and you have a full 3 turns to establish enough of an attritional advantage that the fact that it is second player favored scoring, it's not quite as favored as it necessarily first looks at first glance. So in terms of my deployment, I have reserve dropped the Raicho, and otherwise we have just sort of scattered Datarazi and Warbands throughout our deployment zone, with the important deployments being up here on this rooftop, we have the Extra Vector Operator. The Raicho would reserve drop down onto this rooftop in a quite aggressive spot. We have the Charontid Plasma Rifle Hacker on this rooftop as well, with a Datarazi nearby. The Oznight is playing as a Datarazi in this game. She is there mostly for the Extra, so that she can move around, throw smoke, and then the Extra can shoot through it if needed, because it is a Mimetism MSV2 smoke shooter. But there would be other reasons to put her there as well, including the fact that the T-drone is on this balcony down here. And the reason why it's there is it is the most impersonator resistant position I can put it on. So if we look at this little building, we can see that there's this balcony that's jutting out, and it runs the length of the building. By putting the T-drone down here, I'm putting it in a position where if an impersonator wants to go after it, it's got to literally deploy right down on that building, or maybe on this bridge here, which puts it in prime position to be engaged by any of the pieces on this rooftop, discovered and destroyed before it poses a threat. And in particular, in the unlikely event that Ed chooses to play Janstar, other Spiral players would use Janstar much more frequently, but I'm just taking that sort of into consideration here. In the unlikely event that Ed does play Janstar, I can engage from angles along this part of the rooftop looking down, which means that Janstar is not going to be able to lay a shotgun in ARO in a way that also hits the T-drone, because keeping the T-drone alive in this scenario is very, very important. We'll get to why. Otherwise, we have Bit and Kiss deployed at ground level here. They could split either up this alleyway or central up the table, moving along this direction here. And then we have a Dartok down here in this little nook, basically covering the area of the table around here that Bit and Kiss can't. So what I'm looking for there is to have aggressive turn 1 pitcher coverage, because that is a big part of why I chose to go first. Otherwise, there's Datarazis and Warbands and stuff scattered around the place. In this case, I'm running the version of the list that has the Motorized Bounty Hunter. It is deployed here, and it would do almost nothing the entire game. For Ed's part, his Dral and Tricor Kriegel team would be deployed mostly on this roof, but then partially on ground level here, down here as well. And then the Nima Sitar Kusel Engineer team Kriegel agent team would be deployed sort of relatively far back here, and the Rasail would be deployed sort of up against the table edge over here. Now, this is very good deployment in a scenario like Acquisition. We have 16-inch deployments here, which means that you can deploy, gosh, 16 inches would be something like there as the crow flies, this sort of like line here. Ed is deploying well back. If you're going second in Acquisition, you want to use that depth that the deployment zone provides you and force your opponent to cross as much ground as possible in order to go after you. And in particular against pitches, this is also important. You want your opponent to have to spend as many orders as possible just moving before they get in range to drop a pitcher onto the optimal targets. If Ed had deployed up closer to the front of the 16-inch table line, like that would be sort of like maybe say here on this rooftop, I would have been able to get pitches up that covered those models potentially on the first order of the game. Instead, by using this depth of his deployment zone and deploying back behind this red line, it's going to take me considerably more orders. Ed's reserve drop would be his Greif, which would predictably go after the T-drone, but it would fail the Whip 13 roll and just deploy prone behind this shipping crate. You can actually see it in frame there. Now, we open the first turn with a bunch of impetuous orders. Always like it, I just as a bit of a side note, when I play a faction that has a whole bunch of impetuous models and then I switch to a faction that has no impetuous models, it's always very jarring. There's no issue playing without impetuous, but it's just one of those things where when you have say 2 or 3 impetuous models that you're using the impetuous orders of, it frames the turn in a way that is so interesting to me. It almost gives you thinking time because you don't have to control apart from choosing the order and obviously the actions that they do, you are relatively constrained in terms of how conducting irregular orders works. You just decide if you're going to do them or not, and then usually there's a fairly clear choices to the skills that you declare. And what that means is that when I have a faction, in this case, I think I had 5 models that could meaningfully make impetuous movements between the Gaki Tagers and Dadarazi. It just frames the beginning of your turn really nicely. You do all of the impetuous, and then you get to stop and evaluate and see what happens and move on from there. Also, obviously, it is sort of some free activations. But it's actually just the thinking time almost, like getting to just see a few things play out and then begin to plan within that context. For whatever reason, I've always really enjoyed that, and I find it jarring when I jump back into a faction like, say, Rama Task Force or any of the Pan-Oceanian factions where there are relatively few impetuous orders. It's just weird to start a turn and then be like, oh, I actually have to start playing immediately. I'm not going to have my models play themselves for the first 3 or 4 activations. Anyway, tangent aside, we make fairly good use of our impetuous activations in this turn, in particular getting some smoke. So this Dadarazi will make it up and over the bridge here, and we're going to get some smoke down. We're going to throw it down onto ground level, almost directly downward, to get a smoke template down here, because one of Ed's helots, so the first of Ed's helots is behind this corner here, looking out over open ground here, but the second is behind this corner. It is far forward, because it's obviously its camouflage marker not vulnerable to being pictured off the table on the first turn. And so we get some smoke down in order to allow Bit and Kiss to advance. And from there, we start anti-Toha tactics, which is just bracketing their deployment zone in repeaters. And it is sort of the second part of why this scenario is so difficult, in particular for Spiral Core. Now, if we think about what differentiates Spiral Core and Toha, Spiral Core, they have to be more subtle. They are less robust than Toha. They have fewer symbiomates, fewer symbio bombs, less symbio armor, and less just like high quality gunfighting, in the sense of things like Suquales, etc. They don't have as much eclipse smoke, which means that they're more susceptible to being put in a bad situation if they lose their smoke throwers, that kind of stuff. What they get to make up for that is, frankly, helots. Helots are very, very powerful defensively. They always take too many orders, like more orders than you'd like to try and engage and pick out. The threat that they pose is always somewhat existential because they have multiple bursts, things like light rocket launchers, which being continuous damage. Yes, I can and have lost a tag to a light rocket launcher helot in the past. And that defense, particularly to a player who knows how to deploy them, understands when to reveal them, when not to, how to really maximize not just the threat that they pose, but the time of your opponents they waste, is so powerful. I would say Toha are a more powerful, like just overtly powerful faction than Spiral Core, but it's helots that set Spiral Core apart and go a huge way in making up the difference. And if you have a strategy that nullifies the risk and threat of playing against helots, Spiral Core are left in a very bad place. And that means that the tactic I adopted on the first turn, which is just to spam pitches out onto Ed's deployment zone, which meant that I didn't have to interact with the helots at all, apart from throwing a smoke grenade to allow my models with pitches to advance, flips the script on Spiral Core really badly. Because now, rather than me having to fight into their defenses, they would have to fight into mine. They would have to unpick these repeaters to stop me from throwing missiles at them. They'd have to deal with that. They'd be taking spotlights in ARO. It's miserable for Toha generally because they don't have the kind of pieces that are good at just kind of like, relatively easily and cleanly unpicking things like repeaters. Generally speaking, Toha and Spiral Core are both defined by a good quantity of kind of like middleweight, solidly valuable, diversified threats, which means that there's nothing that you're comfortable just like, it's not like a Gaki destroying a deployable repeater and getting spotlit. Oh no, it was 4 points. I'm willing to wear that. There's really nothing in Spiral Core that you're comfortable taking that hit with. And so just as a tactic, as much as you will see things like Steel Phalanx players complain occasionally about being subjected to guided missile strikes, because against Steel Phalanx, where you have things like Phoenix, that nobody wants to fight Phoenix in active turn, so guided missiles as a fallback tactic tend to get used in the first instance against Steel Phalanx players. Against Toha and against Spiral Core, the tactic isn't just kind of like a necessary last resort. It's genuinely very strong in the first instance and very difficult to play against. You need to position near perfectly, you need to play near perfectly, and often you need to get a little bit lucky to kind of unpick what is being done to you just in this first turn. So what I did was move things forward. I threw down some smoke, I moved things forward, and I fired pitches. Where we would end up placing those pitches, we would get one down behind a car up in this part of the deployment zone here. We're looking in this case to bracket Ed's Dral and Tricor fire team. And then we would get one down over here, which would be very important as well, because you can't quite see it in frame, but here is the Coswell engineer, and it's just within 8 inches of a pitcher being put down here, which we would do with the Dartok. And that is important because in terms of specialists that Ed has access to, the Coswell is really the only one capable of going after this objective. Now, if this is a chain of command Kelta specialist, and indeed it is, it's an option, but it is very difficult for this Kelta to get all the way around here and through this doorway, or all the way up and around here and then backtrack around. The only specialist Ed has that has a nice clean path is the Kosail, so we're going after that. In addition, part of why the Kosail is in this list is because it can quite cleanly remove spotlit from models that have had to be spotlit in the process of killing repeaters. So if I kill it first, that whole tactic goes out the window. So Bit and Kiss move forward, throw out some repeaters, and then the Dartok moves up and around. And it's going to get this picture down here before running in, pressing this button, and then jumping down prone. And pretty much the remainder of the orders that I spend will be spent spotlighting this Dartok and then dropping a missile on its head. Spotlighting this Cosel. So the Cosel dies, and with the Cosel's death, okay, cool, we are in a solid position here. I think the only other thing I do is kill a QAZ creature, which I do. So we have this QAZ creature over here I did mention before. That's Ed's. Mine is hanging out just down here inside this building. I will move a Datarazi up from sort of this position here to kill the QAZ creature. And otherwise, look, pretty much the entirety of the turn is HIMARS or Clock. I don't, from memory, get any other kills on this first turn, and killing, yeah, I think really only one model in the first turn would usually be considered relatively mediocre, but in this case, because I've made some scenario ground that I'm unlikely to lose, I've killed a key piece, and I've put all of these pitches down, which now Ed has to deal with or else get spotlit and remorselessly lit up in reactive turn. I have put Ed in a very difficult position, and he's going to do his best to try and unpick this. And he does fortunately have enough orders to do so, but he has to play this turn basically perfectly, and instead he plays it near perfectly. Now, we actually went back and assessed what needed to be done after the fact, sort of like with the benefit of hindsight, and the play that Ed should have made is to wash most of his Group 1 orders through the Rassail. So the Rassail, and this is a reason of positioning, so the Rassail is able to, I ended up with, by the way, a Taiga creature would end up running all the way up to here. So the Rassail is able to move out in this direction, and this is what it would ultimately do, but it would do so splitting orders back and forth between other models trying to accomplish things. So for example, this Kriegel agent would pop up over this tank, shoot its breaker combi into the repeater, then pop back, and then it would spend an order clearing Spotlight, needing to reset. Now, Ed was able to do that in 2 orders, but if he'd used the Rassail to shoot the repeater from a position, say here, he would not have been subjected to getting spotlit and would have saved 1 order. And it's that kind of like, you recognize those plays, particularly if it's the first time you're playing with a piece, and Ed hasn't played with the Rassail LT in some time, recognize those plays only after the fact. And there was not enough leeway in this game for Ed to do anything less than play perfectly if he needed to have a chance, just because of the strength of the matchup and how well Combined Army does using these tactics that I'm adopting. So Ed would spend a couple of orders ultimately clearing this out. It would be a little bit of faffing around, but what he needed to do, and what he would do about 2/3 of, is that the Rassail needed to move up and around here. Importantly, because there's a Taiga creature that's made its way up behind this building, the Rassail goes first. Don't move the Chaksa out in the first instance. This was another mistake that Ed made, because I willfully and gleefully traded that Shaxa, traded that tiger creature to kill the Chaxa, because the Chaxa is only armor 0, but it is very, very, very good. Yes, technically speaking, it's cheaper than the tiger creature, but you want to keep that Chaxa alive as long as possible, because it's really, really damn good, and the Rassail actually has the wounds to make trades. So what needed to happen was that the Rassail needed to move out, kill the tiger creature, just shoot it with the viral combi a bunch of times. You can take a chain cold hit, it'll be fine. Then move up and around here, fire back this direction into the repeater, destroying it, and then swing around this way, firing in enfilade this direction and kill the QAZ creature, which you'll be able to do from outside of 8 inches. And these are all moves that you can make. I mean, ultimately, the pieces that we're going after here, none of them had weapons that sort of cover matted against, but these are the kind of attacks that you can make with a Rassail because it has nanoscreen. So if there were enough orders remaining, and there probably would have been if he'd done everything just right, he would then have the option to probably swing the Chaxa around to take out the Flash Pulse drone, potentially the Datarazi that had nestled into this nook as well, and move the Rassail in after the Dartok. Now you can expect it to take a couple of orders to kill the Dartok because the damn thing is BTS 6, and what ultimately ended up happening is that Ed got most of that done, but didn't have enough orders left to prosecute the attack into this building or against the R-drone, and so instead pulled the Rassail back to about here and went into suppressive fire just by itself, which left 2 or 3 of my models alive that might otherwise have been dead, and with this antenna now much more easy for me to claim toward the end of the game. Combat Group 2 was spent pretty much entirely on the Greif operator, which used stealth to move up through this crate here and then fire backwards into the repeater that I'd put down near the Drow. And this was another case where Ed needed to be focused and was just very, very slightly discombobulated because there were 3 targets opportunity for the Greif. The first was Kiss, who had moved up to here. Bit had stayed back prone, sort of behind a planter bed down here, and Ed did kill Kiss. The second was, I believe there was a Gaki, thing starting with G, there was a Gaki loitering in this area, which he was shooting. He was splitting burst against the repeater and the Gaki, and wasn't able to kill the Gaki, and ultimately didn't kill. Actually, I think he didn't kill the repeater either, and this was just a consequence of some bad dice, splitting burst. In one case, he got spotlit. And ultimately, none of these plays were particularly bad, but what he probably should have done, firstly, if we think about the repeater, the threat posed by the repeater in particular was to the Dral on this rooftop up here, which he could have solved just by spending 1 order and moving the Dral away. Yes, that would have needed to come out of Combat Group 1, but that was doable. Just move the Dral away. Then you don't need to shoot the repeater, you can leave it there for now, which means that you don't need to, in this case, spend potentially multiple orders trying and failing. You can put those shots into something else. Killing Kiss was good. Should then have attempted to kill the Gaki until it eventually he failed to do so. It would pull back around back into cover, and at that point he should have used the last order rather than going after the repeater again. Should have impersonated. Pulled back into the shipping container, and the reason why you'd want to impersonate there is that he'd been spotlight during the process of that attack, and by being re-impersonated, he can't be targeted with a missile until I go after him and discover him. And that means that when it flips to my turn, rather than spending 1 order to cleanly get 1 kill against a 20-point model, I have to make those attempts to discover, which have potential to fail, etc. So flipping back to my turn, I am down, I think, 0 models, apart from the Tiger creature. I've lost only 1 model. Ed has got his Greif Spotlight, he's lost the Chaxa to the Tiger in my reactive turn, and of course I begin my first turn by doing a little bit of Impetuous, and then firing the missile. We light the Greif up. I don't know if it takes 1 or 2 missiles, but we kill the Greif this turn, and we kill it cleanly because it's Spotlight, and that's just an easy kill at that point. Reactive Spotlights are very, very powerful. Now, one thing I don't have in this list, and I think if I was rewriting it, I probably would include, is an Icadron for baggage. Without baggage, you don't have the ability to reload your pitches, and you're at that, 2 and done with the pitches on the 3 models with pitches. However, it's a nice to have rather than essential, and something to note is that Bit, in addition to having pitches, has deployable repeaters. So if I had an Icadron, I could have just spammed out pitches, fired, reload, etc. Very, very not efficient. In fact, it's inefficient, but it's very difficult for Ed to clear that many at this point. Instead, I'm running a relatively more constrained option if 3 pitches and deployable repeaters can be considered constrained. Still, the Dartok had to fire both of his on the first turn to land the pitcher in this nook here, which has now been destroyed, and Kiss obviously fired both of his in 1 burst to relatively limited effect, but we still have the pitcher on 1 pitcher remaining on Bit, which he would end up moving up and around and laying down this turn. Otherwise, I am going to be a little discombobulated myself this turn because, there are still helots and it is still difficult to attack into them, but there are a couple of things that we're going to do. The first is that this Datarazi will be impetuousing around. It'll actually be this helot will choose to reveal to fight it. I will throw smoke down. I will win that face-to-face roll. That smoke will enable the Exra to move up and put the helot down quite cleanly, smoke shooting, mimetism, etc. And then the Datarazi will continue out and around this way to where the Diplomatic Delegate is. Diplomatic Delegate, of course, against any other model would be attempting to erase me over the course of that journey, but it's a Datarazi, it has Veteran, just one more thing that makes this matchup difficult, and when the Datarazi clears the smoke, he has a shot against the Diplomatic Delegate and the Helot, which he then takes, and he puts down, I think, possibly neither of them, maybe the Diplomatic Delegate. I think he puts down the Diplomatic Delegate with Burst 2 Chain Rifle. The Helot successfully dodges, but having dodged, I'm now able to take it out with a Berserk, I think, from a Gaki. I do attempt a couple of Spitfire shots against this Rasail, but the range is very, very long, and the Rasail succeeds its dodge and gets in behind cover behind this building, which means that the rest of my turn is just using that new picture that Bit has laid down to go after the Dral. If the Dral had pulled back, I wouldn't have been able to do that, but it's still in the same position. However, it is not hugely efficient. This is one of the things that you do have going for you as Toha/Spiral Core. The Dral has the Symbiomate in this particular case, and going after symbiomated models with active turn spotlights can be very inefficient, because a symbiomate just about guarantees survival against the first missile, which gives you a window to reset, and indeed that is what would happen here. Firstly, it would take multiple orders to land Spotlight on the Dral. Then I would need to land a missile on it, and the Dral would successfully reset. And I think at that point, I actually just didn't have enough orders to Spotlight it a second time to go after it with the missiles again. And that really does just reiterate that the active turn missile power against Tohar is not why you're laying down the pitches, it's the reactive efficiency of getting multiple spotlights in ARO, setting up that turn where you get to then just fire all of the missiles for free that is particularly strong. Also, minor correction, I did not shoot a missile at the Greif operator on my second turn because I had a tag sitting literally right here and it just used its tactical awareness to move around and fire 4 dice on 17s. Targeted is still a buff to ballistic skill attacks, and 4 dice on 17s had higher odds of killing the thing, I think, than firing a missile at it. Now, the rest of the turn, the Dartok is in combat group 2, and it really doesn't want to do anything this turn. It has no pitches left, it has nothing nearby to hack. I consider going after the Rasail, but it just does not feel like a good idea. Whip 13 versus Whip 13, hacking versus reset is just not an efficient play to make if you have any other choice, and so we use the remainder of the orders in that group just to begin getting some more scenario ground as the Raicho pops down around to here and doesn't set up on the objective, but just moves forward to a position where it can get onto the objective easily the next turn. And so that sets Ed up to counterattack once again, but at this point he really is beginning to hemorrhage orders. There are far fewer things left. The Chaxa peripheral is no longer present to assist with the Rasail. There just aren't a ton of orders. I mean, there are a few. He's holding up relatively well in that respect, but not great. And there are still pitches that he needs to unpick because Bet relayed them. And so mostly what we have is that the Rasail will attempt to move up and around, and it will get spotlit along the way. And then the Dartok, interestingly, will be in a situation where, and this is something that you can do, if you find this is an option that you have with hackers. The Rasail does make that run on the Dartok. There's no Chaxa to help him out, so it's just the Rasail with its combi rifle, its viral combi rifle. And what happens is the Dartok actually opposes him with Spotlight. Spotlight benefits from Spotlight, so the Dartok is rolling 1 dice on 16s, while the Rasail is firing 3 dice on 15s. And the Dartok either just wins those face-to-face rolls, or, in the case of getting hit by a viral combi once, survives because it's BTS 6. And so the Rasail is kind of forced to just pull back and set up in this position here. It is going to be relatively safe from my guns. I think it kills the R drone. I think it doesn't kill the Datarazi, but there's nothing else going after it at that point. But it's not a particularly effective turn. Ed otherwise just backs away, does what he should have done on the first turn, and backs away from this repeater, just pulling the Dral out under stealth so it's not under threat. Otherwise, the only thing that Ed does this turn is he moves his Lieutenant Rasail into base contact with my HVT, which was hanging out over here, and does the neutralize HVT or whatever it is. It's a whip roll, and it removes the HVT from the table. So on my final turn, I need to just go about pressing the last button, securing the last objectives, basically making it too difficult for Ed to recover any of the things he might possibly do to recover the scenario. I think over the course of this game, I have also accomplished Predator, my first classified, and This turn, I'm going to whip roll a HVT with my hacker, so whip roll an enemy data scan, an enemy trooper with my hacker Lieutenant Charonted. So there isn't a ton to do here, but I will make a hash of the first action. Now, when I mentioned before, right, the tag against the targeted Draal, I took that shot against the targeted Draal because it was better odds than trying to fire a missile. This is often true. Often you will have just shoot the thing that's targeted. It's going to be a very good face-to-face roll. With the irregular order of this biker that's been hanging out here this entire time, these crates are see into or out of, but not through, so it couldn't be seen until something entered the crate. I take the irregular order with the biker, and I fire 3 rounds with the submachine gun into the back of the Rassel, which I think does 0 damage. It's a targeted Rassel, but it still has cover, so it's 3 dice on 15s. At this point, my brain goes, yes, ballistic skill failed. Ballistic skill again. And at that juncture, I should have just fired the damn missile. I used the biker in the first instance because I had an irregular order, and I didn't want to, I didn't have the command tokens to turn its order regular or anything like that. But I spent too many orders this turn faffing around trying to kill a Rassail and failing before eventually just ballistic skill attack as the first short skill with the biker and then just run into close combat. And that is what would actually end up subduing the Rassel, because it turns out fighting your way clear of a motorized bounty hunter with a para CCW -6 is very, very difficult. So in Ed's turn, next turn, he would attempt to actually dodge clear of the, or CC attack clear of the biker, and he would get stun batoned for his trouble, leaving the Dartok to neatly secure this objective. Otherwise, the Rasyat would move up and forward, not Rasyat, Raicho would move up and forward on touching this objective, going to suppressive fire, with a Dadarazi moving up and around behind him, and then the first objective would be locked down by Bit and the Charontid. That let me end my third turn with both of these side buttons both controlled and activated, and the central button controlled, and both of my classifieds accomplished, and there's just realistically no way for Ed to do enough to dislodge me from all of those. He had effectively no force left on what was my left flank. He had no force that could meaningfully challenge both the Raicho and the Dadarazi that the Raicho was covering, which left him really just with the Tricor to move out and try and deal with the Charontid and Bit sitting on this objective, which he got most of the way done, effectively. Over the course of multiple orders, he was able to kill Bit and dislodge the Charontid. I think I stayed there fighting for most of the time, but he did eventually, a Draal eventually, I think, put the Charontid down and got onto but didn't activate the objective, which left Ed with just his one classified done and 1 point for seizing that antenna. I had all of the remaining points scored, which gave me, I think, 9 points. That's 2 points for each antenna activated, 1 point for an antenna seized, 3 points for the central console seized, and 2 points for my classifieds. Now, that is not by any stretch of the imagination an indictment of Ed as a player. He's a very, very good Spiral Core player. It is more of an examiner of why this matchup is just really, really challenging for Spiral Core. This kind of pitcher, repeater, maybe some very judicious active turn hacking. The active turn hacking, with the exception of killing the Kosail, active turn hacking for me was quite ineffective. It was the fact that the threat of the reactive turn hacking, the multiple spotlights back, and then the easy missile or ballistic skill attack kills meant that Ed had to unpick that material defense that I had put out in front of him, which flipped the whole script that the helots usually present. That is what makes this matchup so difficult. Also, veteran close assault units. It's a very, very difficult game. I think with absolutely perfect play, like only in hindsight, after figuring out everything that potentially needed to be done, with absolutely perfect play, I think Ed was in with a potential chance. It is possible that the Rassail team actually manages to kind of break through the bulk of what's going on in this side of the deployment zone, or the side of the table, rather. The Draal can potentially deal with the Raicho, like etc. etc. Even then, I think as Spiral Core, you are playing this one just for the narrowest possible win, just trying to get across the line, even if it's just 5 points to 4 or something like that. Which in turn means that a lot of the time you need to get classifieds that you can do, etc. So it is a very challenging matchup. It's one of the few matchups in the game that I would say is really slanted against one side out the gate. And it is, to be frank, a big part of why I like this combined army list so much. So, Jordan and Matt, I hope you both enjoyed this battle report, a showcase of some of the things a list like this can do, particularly into a faction that otherwise is considered pretty difficult to play into. and generally just as a showcase of some of the things this list can do. As always, if you'd like to support this channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member. Big thanks to everyone who has so far. As this video shows, I take requests for lists and battle reports and topics like things like faction focuses from channel supporters. In terms of content coming up, I hope to do another faction focus either late this week, early next week. I have a list of factions I'd like to do faction focuses for, including Varuna, Invincible Army, Caledonia, and Rama Task Force. All of those are on the short list. I hope people are looking forward to them. Otherwise, as always, I hope very much that you enjoyed this, and I will see you next time.